It's only a leak of a draft. Still, punches have already been thrown outside the U.S. Supreme Court in the first standoff over Justice Samuel Alito's 98-page argument in favor of overturning the 1973 ruling that legalized abortion across the United States. We'll ask whether the document linked to Politico is a turning point for more than just reproductive rights. Abortion would still be legal in many states, but Justice Alito goes beyond a case that revolves around Mississippi's decision to ban the termination of pregnancies after 15 weeks. He evokes the Constitution in calling for, quote, the return of the issue to the people's elected representatives. Otherwise put, states' rights would trump those of the federal government. In a nation where nearly 6 in 10 citizens support legal abortions, how will total bans go down? How aggressively will more conservative rural jurisdictions enforce that ban? More broadly, can the United States lay claim to a moral high ground on the world stage when it's at war with itself on matters of liberty, faith, privacy, and women's rights? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking, could this be a constitutional crisis? Joining us from Washington, Carolyn Frederickson, professor at law at Georgetown University. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
From New York City, Sherry Berman, professor of political science at Barnard College, author of Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, from the Ancien Régime to the Present Day. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Laure Mondeville is senior correspondent for French broadsheet Le Figaro, author of, how do you translate, Les Révoltés d'Occident?
The Insurgents of the West.
The Insurgents of the West. Thanks for joining us. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. The U.S. President Joe Biden insisting his administration will be ready to respond to protect abortion rights when a ruling is issued. For that, well, he'll have to stare down a Supreme Court where 5 and possibly 6 justices out of 9 favor rolling back a ruling that's now nearly half a century old. Catherine Viette has more.
Could the legal right to abortion be in jeopardy? A leaked Supreme Court document strongly suggests Roe v. Wade will be struck down by the conservative-leaning justices, upending nearly 50 years of constitutional protections and legal precedent. In the draft majority opinion obtained by the website Politico, conservative Justice Samuel Alito wrote that the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade decision granting national access to abortion was egregiously wrong from the start, and that Roe and Casey must be overruled. It goes on to state that there is no constitutional right to abortion services and that it should be left to the states to decide. Protesters for and against abortion quickly gathered outside the Supreme Court.
They are not going to get away with this. Let me say that I don't care what I have to do, but they're not going to do this to D.C., and they are not going to do this to America. There's more of us than there is of them, and we are going to fight.
I'm very passionate about being pro-life, and I'm just here as an observer to see what the attitude is like and kind of witness history.
According to Politico, the draft is from February and is in response to the case before the court challenging Mississippi's ban on abortion after 15 weeks. It's not clear if the draft is the court's final word on the matter. During the process, justices have been known to change their opinions. Reproductive rights in the U.S. have been under threat for decades, and should the Supreme Court overturn Roe, nearly 24 states have so-called trigger laws on the books that would go into effect, banning abortion.
Now, before we go into that leaked brief, let me begin with you, Sherry Berman. What's the significance of this moment? You get the feeling that, we knew that there was this conservative-dominated Supreme Court. We knew that many states are ready to pull the trigger on banning abortion. Yet there's this feeling sitting here in Paris when we watch it that there's surprise in the U.S.
Well, look, the United States is now a very polarized polity. So almost anything that the Supreme Court does of significance is going to be sort of received as a very, very serious move on the part of intense partisans. And abortion, of course, is one of the most sensitive issues in American politics. And so this decision has really been seen as a kind of litmus test for both the left and the right for some time now. So anything that changes the status quo is going to be received with a lot of anger, a lot of passion on both sides. I will say, though, since we have law professors on this panel, that from the perspective of democracy, one thing that you noted in your beginning statement that I think is important is that the court, at least in Alito's draft, says the time has come to return this decision to the people. And while that is interpreted by the left in this country as an inherently problematic stance, from a comparative perspective, this is in fact not unusual. In France, in other parts of Europe, abortion as a right came as the result of legislation, not as the result of the equivalent of a Supreme Court decision. And so this is not, as you say, outlawing abortion. What it is doing is returning it to the people at the state level. It could be decided at the federal level, but that, of course, depends on votes and on politics.
Yeah, and that brings us to the U.S. Constitution. Carolyn Frederickson, why hasn't there been legislation on abortion at a national level in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, it's not really about the Constitution so much as it's about the Senate rules. As Professor Berman rightly suggests, I mean, there is a democratic avenue for this. Of course, many of us feel, though, that women's reproductive rights and bodily autonomy are a fundamental right that should be protected by our Constitution like other fundamental rights. But nonetheless, the Congress could certainly step in and pass legislation. But because we have an anti-majoritarian process in the Senate, because a small handful of the Senate can block broadly popular legislation, and I think that's what would legislating for reproductive rights would be, in fact, something broadly popular in the United States. But because we have that filibuster, until that is reformed or jettisoned altogether, it's basically impossible to get that kind of legislation through, unfortunately. So we're kind of stuck here, which is why the court's impending decision, likely decision, is so tragic for women in America, because there's not any near ready solution.
No near solution. Laure Mondeville, you said you're not surprised by what you see unfolding.
No, I'm not surprised because, when I got to the US in 2008 to become correspondent, I discovered a totally different society. That is, in France, abortion was accepted by the majority of the people. But America is a very different place with extremely polarized and divided views on the significance of abortions. You have a much more religious society where, huge segments of the population, especially in the South and in different states, they just don't accept this. And so, in fact, Roe versus Wade actually put a sort of cover, on a problem and on a controversy and divide, which was never resolved. And that's why, Samuel Alito in his,
So why was it?
His decision, he talks about exercise of raw judicial power because a segment of the population think that it was not democratically sought out, in persuading other citizens that this was right. And that means that it was bound to be a boomerang effect. I remember traveling to the South and discovering the fierce opposition of the people and how they were fighting on and on to stop this. And so I think that, what they are doing, and they want to go back to the states, and it's up to the states to decide that. That's what they want.
So there was a bitter battle here in France in the 1970s, but it was, as Sherry Berman mentioned at the outset, settled in the National Assembly with a vote.
Exactly.
And then France moved on?
Yes, there are, questions coming back from some segments of the populations about, the time, the limit, the time limit for abortion. This is something which is sometimes, in the public debate, and there is part of the conservative right in France, the Catholic right, who is, for stricter maybe limits, etc. But basically, if you look at France, this is not an issue that you would say is boiling, on the oven. And in America, it seems to me it still is. So that's why it's coming back.
It also is, you could say, in places like Poland. So
exactly, which is a much more conservative society, much more religious, and the problem is that.
So what is it about abortion? Why is it such a hot button?
Because it's about life, and and actually, one has to recognize that. It's not an easy decision to decide at what point, the viability, of a fetus and of life. And that's why it's such a touchy issue that on the one hand, it's privacy, it's the right of a woman, and it's legitimate also, questions and freedom. And on the other side, there is the question of life and the right of the fetus. So that's why it's so controversial, so hot.
Carolyn Frederickson brings us back to the initial question. What for you is the significance of this moment?
Well, I mean, I do think abortion is, obviously by itself a controversial issue, but I do think it's a stand-in in many ways. Why it's boiling right now in America is not just because abortion is connected to a certain worldview and a religious worldview versus the kind of the more modern, liberated issues that women face, that women have kind of come out. They're working, life, the society is changing. But I think abortion is more of a kind of a symbolic, in many ways, of the overall partisan divisions in America between red states and blue states, and it has become the focal point. But I think it is, and why it boils more perhaps in the United States, again, is because it became the issue that was the mobilizing issue for a lot of the right. I don't think it actually really used to be quite that way. Roe versus Wade really kind of changed a moment in America where perhaps as Professor Berman was talking about earlier, about the kind of democratic process, maybe it arrested that democratic process in some way. Yes. And turned Roe into, again, this kind of symbolic issue around all sorts of cultural change in America. And so I think it is a very difficult moment for us as a society because Roe fits the overturning of Roe that is so likely to happen, is a major battle in the war for sort of the culture of America. And we'll see what happens as we go into our midterm elections. Will it be a galvanizing issue for the left and for the Democrats or not?
Absolutely.
A war for cultural America. We'll address that point in a moment. Reactions have been, of course, pouring in since Monday evening in the United States. The Texas Attorney General rooting for a victory for states' rights. Ken Paxton tweeting his support, saying he, along with 23 other states are in the coalition in support of Mississippi's law banning abortion after 15 weeks. I'll continue to ensure that Texas protects the unborn and pray for the end of abortion across the nation. Is that what this is really about, Sherry Berman? A victory for local democracy or statewide democracy over a federal government that can seem distant in your country?
Well, look, I think it's very important for your listeners to understand that the term states' rights, while it may seem kind of neutral, has a very problematic resonance in the American context. Of course, it's tied up with slavery and the legacy of slavery. So that term itself is very problematic. But I do want to return to this point I think that we've all been talking about, right, which is the sort of the efficacy of shoving important, symbolic, difficult decisions onto the court. I mean, many supporters of abortion, including late Justice Ruth Ginsburg, were very concerned about the fact that the Supreme Court had made this decision on Roe. She noted, precisely as you had and some of my fellow panelists had, that there was a process of admittedly slow but noticeable change in public opinion on this issue. And this Supreme Court decision kind of stopped that. It kind of dropped it in its tracks, and it not only left the left without the kind of local level mobilizing and persuasion that has led to abortion rights progress in other countries, in Latin America and in Europe. And also mobilize the right, because rather than thinking, okay, we lost because a majority of voters chose to elect politicians who supported abortion rights, they looked to the courts and they said, look, the courts did this. They are unelected. This is judicial activism. It is undemocratic. And this led to a decades-long effort on the part of conservatives in the United States, not only focusing on local and state level elections, but focusing on generating a generation of conservative justices who were committed not only obviously to a shift in abortion rights, but to a whole variety of other conservative causes. I mean, look, whether you support abortion rights or not, I think we do have to use this as a moment to think about what happens in a country when these kinds of decisions are not decided by the people. The people don't always make the quote unquote right decisions, but democracy has a certain legitimacy that the courts will never have. And again, I do want to stress that in Europe, where abortion laws will probably now be much more liberal than the United States, these were for the most part, again, decided by elected legislators. Right? This is also true more recently in the places in Latin America where we have seen advances in reproductive rights, the result of a long-term process of organizing, of mobilizing, and persuasion. Unfortunately, perhaps the right has been better at this over the last several decades than the left has. We now, people on the left, have to make a choice. We can protest this decision for sure, but the really hard work lies ahead of convincing people that this would be a bad move for the United States, and that abortion rights are something we want to secure, not just in New York and California, but across the entire United States of America.
Well, on this point, let me bring in at this point Ilya Somin from Arlington, Virginia, professor of constitutional law at George Mason University. Your books include Democracy and Political Ignorance, Why Smaller Government is Smarter. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you for having me.
Do you agree with what you just heard from Sherry Berman, that in fact this could clear the air in terms of what the United States thinks on matters like this?
Maybe, but I think whether the Supreme Court reverses Roe versus Wade or not, there is going to be a lot of conflict over abortion, I think, for a long time to come, because unlike a number of other issues like same-sex marriage, for example, and some others, this is an area where there have been persistent divisions for many decades. There has not been a lot of movement in public opinion, and it's not simply because of the Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade. It's because this is a genuinely divisive issue, and one where on the one hand, you have people think that abortion is equivalent to murder. And on the other hand, you have people who believe that it's a fundamental right of women, and it's extremely important in that regard. So I think it'll be a long time before this conflict is resolved. I would add also that it's not entirely clear that if Roe versus Wade is overruled, that the matter will just be left to the states. Republicans have proposed, some of them, to make a nationwide ban on many kinds of abortions. And obviously, Democrats have proposed legislation that would be nationwide going the other way. And to the extent that the federal government will get involved in this area, then that will raise the stakes of the conflict and make it more severe.
Let's talk about this 98-page opinion. It's interesting because usually, apparently, most Supreme Court rulings or opinions, and again, this is just a draft for now, they run about 20 pages. This one is close to 100. In the leaked document, Justice Alito argues that there's an unbroken tradition of, quote, criminally punishing abortion that's deeply rooted in the nation's history. Legal scholar and activist Lindsay Simmons answers, you know what else isn't deeply rooted in American history? Equality, voting rights, contraception, privacy, workers' rights. Beware, they are signaling to the other autocrats that this is the path for dismantling progress. You mentioned a moment ago, Ilya, the issue of same-sex marriage. There are genuine fears that this will roll back gay rights if this draft becomes the final opinion.
I think that's very unlikely for two reasons. One is there are passages in the draft which go out of their way to say, A, we're only talking about abortion and not anything else. B, there are even passages which distinguish the case of abortion from these other cases by emphasizing the point that here there's an argument that innocent life is being taken, whereas that argument certainly doesn't apply to same-sex marriage or to any of the other points that were made before. I would add that I think for both reasons of legal doctrine and also other more political types of reasons, there's no way there's going to be 5 votes in the Supreme Court to reverse the decision on same-sex marriage or some of the others that were just mentioned. One reason for that is obviously not a purely legal one, which is that same-sex marriage now enjoys something like 65 to 70% majority support in the U.S. Reversing the decision on same-sex marriage would anger a huge number of people, much more than reversing Roe versus Wade would. And it's not a major priority of most people on the political right, except for the most extreme social conservatives. So I think this may have implications for some other areas of legal doctrine. It's unlikely to have much effect on some of these sort of big picture questions that have been raised, like contraception or same-sex marriage, both for the technical legal reasons mentioned in the opinion and for broader political reasons as well.
Carolyn Frederickson, your thoughts on Justice Alito harking back to history in his draft?
Well, first of all, I think his history is wrong in many ways. I mean, American states and localities dealt very differently with abortion and reproductive rights throughout our history. But nonetheless, I do think we have to recognize that as a country, hopefully, I think we have improved and our Constitution has gotten better. We also, something that was deeply embedded in our Constitution is slavery. So that we have to remember that hopefully that we are better now than we were at the founding in terms of protecting fundamental rights and freedoms in this country. But I also think I would not, I have to discount somewhere more than my friend Ilya, the avowal by Supreme Court justices on the right not to touch these other areas. It wasn't very long ago that the recent justices swore that they were faithful to precedent and weren't going to touch Roe. Let's be real here. I mean, the moment could well come, and I think there is perhaps the other issues aren't quite as hot politically right now as abortion, but issues around transgender have really been stirred up in this country. Another fake debate that the right has thrown up as red meat for their political base. But I can certainly see that if the right wing is successful, as it looks like they will be in overturning Roe and then work on a nationwide ban, they're going to have their eyes on these other areas. And I don't feel that we can just rest, confident that, women's reproductive rights have been destroyed, but, gays and lesbians can still get married. So no worries there. That access to contraception is fully protected. Well, I mean, there are many on the right who think that certain forms of contraception are actually abortion. So, I think, we are in a very dangerous place for women in America.
Public opinion in the United States squarely favors keeping abortion legal. Last year, the Pew Research Center charted surveys saying 59% say abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And this, you can see on this graph, it's pretty steady over the years. But access to abortion is about to grow more restricted. Abortion clinics would quickly shut entirely in 22 states, representing 42% of American women. Here's a map of the United States here, compiled by the New York Times. You can see where it would be. Laure Mondeville, when you look at this map, you could replace the word abortion with lots of issues, right?
Exactly. Gun rights and. What else? Yes, a lot of issues, all these cultural issues. What is very striking, for, I think, a French observer is really to what extent the cultural issues remain this sort of a huge polarizing factor in American society on both sides. That what strikes me, and that's actually the topic of my book, is that politics in the U.S. is becoming a religious fight.
A religious fight.
A religious fight.
Because you heard Carolyn Frederickson talk about a war for cultural America. You're saying it's a religious fight.
It's becoming
Why is
a
that?
religious fight when each side thinks that it's on the side of the good or of the wrong, and evil and
Hasn't that
right.
always been the case?
Yes, it has always been the case. But what is true is that the specificity of the American system was actually that politics was the agreement to disagree to a certain extent, and to sort out disagreements by discussion, by fighting, political fighting. But it seems that, in moments of crisis, and that's certainly the moment the American system is in, is the moment of when there is no willingness to agree to disagree. And that means that you are going to try to eradicate your adversary, to push him out, to excommunicate your adversary. And that's what's happening now. And, it's very interesting that it was absolutely after Roe versus Wade that the moral majority emerged in the US, and you had this huge surge in conservative views, and which brought actually Reagan to power a few years later. He's the consequence of Roe versus Wade to a large extent, and now if this reemerges, we would probably see the left getting galvanized, as someone said, and it's probably going to play out as a very strong political issue.
His statement this Tuesday was, we're going to make this a big issue. I'm paraphrasing here.
From his
in November. From
his point of view as a Democrat, he's right. From his point of view as a president, I'm not totally sure, because what is really frightening at the moment is this sort of these two volcanoes on the political stage, and President Biden sort of hovering above the volcanoes, and you don't really know if he's going to be. How much will such a confrontation help him with the huge, challenges he has, like you mentioned in your introduction, for instance, the war in Ukraine, and how do Americans get united in the face of big challenges?
Yeah, this Tuesday, by the way, marks the kickoff of primary voting season ahead of the November midterm elections in the U.S. Polls open in Indiana and Ohio, where Republican contenders for a vacant Senate seat, like best-selling commentator J.D. Vance, all battle for that most treasured of prizes, an endorsement by Donald Trump. And again, when you see those images of candidates for Senate getting a handshake from Trump, and you hear Laure Mondeville talk about this polarization of America. Sherry Berman, do you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, that this decision has come now, and that this decision is going to have the kinds of further polarizing consequences that you just mentioned, I mean, is a result of the context that we are in now. This is a very polarized country with strong partisans on both sides. I want to get back to this point and connect it to something you said earlier about public opinion data. I think it's very misleading to look at public opinion data. Sure, the polls seem to indicate a consistent majority in favor of abortion. But the reality is, as it is with other issues as well, is it's that the people who care most, in some ways, the people with the most extreme views, who always have the most influence, they're the ones who mobilize, they're the ones who vote, they're the ones who contact their representatives. So the fact that some majority of Americans in some abstract way support abortion rights does not tell us very much in a democracy about what is actually going to get passed. The Democratic Party supports a whole variety of positions that don't have majority support because their activists are very passionate about those issues. So the point remains that for those who care about abortion rights and reproductive rights, a lot of hard work lies ahead if this draft is in fact reflective of the decision that is ultimately going to come down. We have to, on the left, Democrats have to, progressives have to figure out some way to shift public opinion not only further into the category of favoring abortion rights, but of figuring out ways to get people to vote on this issue, to come up with viable compromises that can get enough people on board to actually pass legislation at the state level, potentially at the federal level, although as my colleague pointed out, as long as we have the filibuster, that is going to be extremely difficult. But that's really where we are. We need to convince people to vote on this and to vote on it in states that do not already have a progressive or Democratic majority. This is a long-term battle that abortion rights and reproductive rights advocates are going to have to recognize that they face.
Of course, it concerns much more than just abortion, right? Ilya Soman, there are states like Texas criminalizing the import and purchase and use of abortion pills. How far will some of these states go, again, in criminalizing women who have abortions, doctors who perform abortions? Will they criminalize those who go cross state lines to go get their abortions? What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's going to vary a lot state by state. The more conservative the state, arguably the farther they might go. So a state like Mississippi might go further than Texas, which is much more close to evenly divided than Mississippi is. I think you're going to see a lot of variation because there is varying public and elite opinion in those states. That said, I will also say that I think it's going to be very difficult for the states to enforce the more extreme of these regulations, particularly the ones restricting abortion pills or ones restricting out-of-state travel to get an abortion and the like, as we've seen with other efforts to suppress market transactions that people really want. There's going to be a lot of evasion, as we've had with the war on drugs, with the federal government's efforts to block immigration and many other things of this sort. So I think those states that do the more extreme measures, if they're serious about trying to enforce them, they will buy themselves many of the same kinds of problems as the war on drugs has led to.
Carolyn Frederickson, is that a fair comparison?
Yeah, well, I do think there's always more slippage in things like this. And, the question of how much resistance there's going to be on the ground. Certain kinds of laws are very hard to enforce. And certainly getting access to abortion drugs is something that I think is going to be enormously complicated for any government to try and police. So, and I do think it will mean, an endless churning of politics and debate and partisanship around women's health, which is just, a terrible outcome that women in America are going to have every choice that they make questioned. You see states criminalizing miscarriages and so forth, and abortions that women need to have because their life is in danger. In certain states, that's now going to be illegal. It's a death sentence for women with a difficult pregnancy. So, I think I certainly hope that it means that that Americans who are broadly in favor of reproductive rights and abortion access are going to push back and create a legal framework across the United States that is actually supportive of women's health, rather than this destructive outcome.
They say that, or you can explain this to us, Carolyn Frederickson, that a ruling from 1973 was framed not around the issue of abortion, but privacy. Can you explain that for our viewers?
Well, sure. There have been a series of decisions from the Supreme Court that dealt with contraception and other areas of private life, where the court had found that the Constitution protected these kinds of private decisions. And then what they set up was a kind of complex regulatory framework in some ways that gave increasing purview to the state as the pregnancy got later. That is, women in consultation with their doctors had the ability to make choices about their own bodies through the first and second trimesters, and then with the third trimester was an increasing place for government to step in with protections for women's health in case her health was endangered by the pregnancy. So It was not about abortion specifically, in the sense that abortion, the word is not in the Constitution, but the concepts in the Constitution that had protected other areas of privacy were seen as directly analogous to enabling women to make these decisions about their own bodies.
The word abortion's not in the Constitution, Ilya Soman. Neither is the word privacy. So is this rollback privacy rights?
I suppose it depends on what is meant by privacy rights, because that's a very broad concept that people disagree about what falls within it. I think I would say a couple of things on this. One is obviously the word that actually is in the Constitution in relevant provision is liberty. And with things like contraception and some other examples, there's a very strong case that this is a part of your liberty that has little or no effect on other people. By contrast, with abortion, it's a tougher sell because there is this non-trivial argument, which I disagree with, but it is a serious argument that abortion is the taking of innocent life, which contraception is not, same-sex marriage is not, and many of the other examples that people have mentioned. And therefore, I think this is why Roe versus Wade has been massively controversial and has mobilized enormous opposition in a way that most of the other decisions in the areas that we've talked about have not, at least not to anything like the same extent. So that said, I do think there isn't really any general right of privacy in the Constitution. What there is a right of liberty plus some protections for other more specific rights, and whether a concept that can be described as privacy falls within those broader categories, is going to vary from case to case.
There's consequences beyond U.S. borders when it comes to policy on things like family planning, reproductive rights. We saw it when the United States withdrew funding for UN organizations that promoted promoted family planning in the developing world. Right now, Laurent Mondeville, you mentioned it earlier.
Yes.
There's a war going on in Europe.
Right.
And the United States' big task is rallying, quote unquote, the troops being European nations, and steeling their resolve. Those European nations, do they still think the United States has the, quote, moral high ground when they see what's happening domestically over there?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think there was, especially in the last few years, under Trump certainly, and even during the beginning of the Biden administration, we've seen a lot of questions about, this American democracy, which used to be seen as this sort of strong elder brother, as sort of really, I would say, like a monument of the democratic balance and now, of course, with the divisions we've seen with the 6th of January, with this really all these divides that we saw even in the leakage leaking the information from the Supreme Court about what was going on, which is also seen, I think, perceived by the observers as something very bad, because
it's very rare to have.
It's very rare.
It's happened, but it's rare,
and it shows to what extent the American democratic House, is divided when even one of his most sacred institutions is actually not behaving as a family, as it is usually presented by the experts of the Supreme Court, but as a divided house, a part of this divided house, and I think there are questions in Europe, of course, but at the same time, I would say that since the beginning of this war, the administration has been very skillful, and I think quite, I would say, efficient in gathering the allies and in orchestrating a strategy which is seen as resolute and very strong statement. And actually, I would say it's the first foreign policy action of the administration, which is really convincing, because we saw,
Is it a little less convincing now that you have this ruling? Because this is not Joe Biden who's deciding; he's dead set against it. But it's a reminder that,
Yes, it is a reminder. And I think the enemies of America are going to use this, and they have been using it, as you know, that Vladimir Putin, for instance, sort of tried to play the card of the American divide, and he even, sort of interfered in the electoral process, by, hacking part of the electoral process. So of course, the scenery of American divides is a problem, but in Europe we understand that we do have our divides as well. So it's a problem for America, and I think Biden had already difficulties actually in gathering support and a total anti-front against Russia within Congress, because you have actually the Republican Party especially is very divided. First of all, the whole American, I would say, foreign policy landscape has turned more isolationist, on the whole. Right. And actually it's a relief in Europe to see that it's not actually so strong, because the Americans are coming back. But a lot of Republicans have been, extremely isolationist in their stances. We've seen people like Tucker Carlson, who has a very strong, impact on the political debate on the right at the beginning,
with a strong isolationist stance.
He's shifting now, against Putin, but at the beginning he was very slow.
So Sherry Berman, viewers watching this show from Eastern Europe right now, they're grateful and thankful when there's U.S. firepower being brought in to face down a Russian threat. When they hear victories for states' rights, and you heard there Laure Mondeville talk about the isolationist streak that's run through U.S. history. Again, what's happening on abortion? Is it something that we should worry about here?
I wouldn't suggest that folks in Eastern Europe worry about this, at least over the short to medium term. I mean,
when they talk about states' rights, for instance.
No, I think the point that you have made, and that some of my colleagues have also made, that this does reflect a very serious battle that's going on not only within my country here, the United States, but also within the Republican Party, between a faction that really is isolationist, believes in state rights in the quote unquote old-fashioned sense of the term, and really has some views and policy preferences that I think most Europeans would find extremely problematic. However, foreign policy is still one area where there is some bipartisanship. I think you can see that in the Republicans, for the most part, that are in the House and Senate, who have at least tacitly supported Biden on this, who are less isolationist than surely some of those figures that you mentioned in the media and at the state level. So I would not suggest that this is a problem over the short to medium term. I would, however, say that, as we have been discussing throughout this segment, the divisions that exist within the United States between Democrats and Republicans, to some degree, within also both of those parties, these are very problematic. They weaken our country. They weaken our democracy. They stop the United States from being a strong proponent of democracy, not only in Europe, but across the globe. And these are the divisions that we really need to focus on figuring how to solve if we are going to have a productive politics in the United States and have the United States be able to play some positive leadership role across the globe.
Carolyn Frederickson, we're out of time, but let me just ask you, because research shows that if the 1973 decision is overturned, most of those who will be having unwanted pregnancies are the poorest, those who can't travel to different states. Again, this growing inequality gap, is that a ticking time bomb, or will, if I speak callously, will those people just kind of fall off the radar of politics?
Well, I certainly hope not, but I worry very much about that. I mean, there's a lot of effort right now in the blue states. They're passing laws that will anchor reproductive rights and access to abortion very deeply in their law. They're also passing laws that will provide assistance to women to travel from other states. But, I don't know how long that kind of generosity will continue, and how much fervor will continue into the future. So it is certainly something that it will be and could be a very big problem for the United States. We already have so much inequality We have inequality in healthcare already, and now it's going to be the worst for women of color, and low-income women of color in particular, who live in red states, who are going to face potentially devastating consequences.
And we'll be talking about it more in upcoming editions. Carolyn Frederickson, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Ilya Somin in Arlington, Virginia, Sherry Berman in New York City, Laure Montville. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.